Is there ever a good time to clean your garage? As far as I'm concerned, not really. The temperature was above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and my t-shirt was so drenched in sweat that it clung to my body like a second skin. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time left. Within a couple of weeks, I'd be back in class explaining the difference between a quarter note and a half note to the next generation of Mozarts. If I didn't clear out the garage, I'd have to leave the car in the driveway all winter. That wouldn't be an issue if we lived in Arizona, but in Chicago, it wasn't exactly fun. It's incredible how much junk two people can accumulate in just 6 years of marriage. Well, to be fair, a lot of what I was sorting through was from before Yulia and I got together. For instance, I found Yulia's old laptop in one of the boxes. I knew it was the one she used in college, and even back then, it was old. I did some digging, found the charger, and plugged it in to see if it still worked. Nothing. I left it charging while I continued cleaning and checked it again a couple of hours later, still nothing. Since it wasn't mine, I knew I should ask before tossing it out, so I set it aside. Yulia was surprised when she got home from work. She walked in and looked around. Wow, you've been busy. It looks great, honey. Do you think we'll be able to fit both cars in here this winter? Not yet, I said, pointing to some boxes in the far corner. But I still have to go through that part tomorrow. I know there are things I can toss, and I haven't finished organizing the rest. We'll have plenty of space when I'm done. I'm impressed, Yulia said. I had no idea you'd get this far. Did you start anything for dinner? I just looked at her, sweat running down my face. That's okay, she said with a laugh. I'll start dinner. You need a shower. No truer words have ever been spoken, I replied. I'd been working since 8:30 in the morning and hadn't even stopped for lunch. I took my time in the shower. While I was in there, I heard Yulia changing in the bedroom. I half hoped she'd come in to wash my back, but no such luck. When I came out, she was chopping potatoes. I grabbed a beer from the fridge. Can I help? I asked. I don't think so. You've done enough work for today, she answered. I've got pork in the oven. Dinner won't be ready for a while, so just go relax. Your wish is my command, I joked. I took my beer to the living room and settled into my recliner. Once she had the potatoes boiling, Yulia joined me with a glass of wine. I know you told me already, but I forgot. Where are you playing this Friday? At Plato's Play en Own, I replied. Why do you ask? Thinking about coming? It's been a while since you've been to a show. Actually, some of the girls at the office were talking about getting together for a bachelorette party. I thought maybe I'd show them that I'm not only married to the best music teacher in the world but also to someone who's great on the guitar. What time do you start? She asked. 9. Oh, that's a bit late. They'll probably want to start heading home by then. Maybe I can convince the guys to start a little earlier. I don't think the manager at Plato's will mind an extra half hour of free entertainment. That would be great, honey. Can you play Guitar Man right away? I laughed. It was really amazing to have a wife who was so proud of me. Guitar Man is definitely a song that makes the guitarist stand out in the band, and I always enjoyed seeing how the crowd would get excited whenever we played it. Well, I'll have to talk to the guys and make sure they can show up early, but if they're okay with it, sure, we'll make it the 5th or 6th song in the first set. I need a little time to warm up before playing that one. Later, during dinner, I thought about the laptop. Hey, honey, I found your old laptop in the garage. It doesn't work anymore, can I toss it? Oh. I completely forgot about that. No, don't throw it out just yet. There are still a bunch of college photos on it. When it stopped working, someone told me the data could still be recovered, but I forgot what was on there. I know there are pictures of the girls from my sorority and a lot of us having fun together. I'll probably never see most of those girls again, so I'd really like to save those photos if it's possible. She'd likely need to take it to one of those computer repair shops. I wasn't exactly a computer genius, but I knew that recovering files from a hard drive wasn't that difficult. Bob Kramer, our computer science teacher, used to do it all the time whenever the school's computers failed. Yulia's birthday was coming up in 6 weeks. I had already bought a nice pendant on a payment plan and was planning to take her out for a fancy dinner, but I could really surprise her by recovering those photos, and it wouldn't even cost me anything. I could already imagine her expression when she opened the little box with the USB drive. The next morning, after Yulia left for work, I put the laptop and the charger in my car's trunk, where they would stay until I could catch Bob. By 2 p.m., I had finished cleaning out the garage. It had been a lot of work, but now there was enough room for both cars. I parked mine inside and rolled down the garage doors, knowing Yulia would be pleasantly surprised when she got home. After a quick shower, I started calling the other guys in the band to see if they could start early on Friday night. Once I got everyone's agreement, I called the manager at Plato's to confirm it was okay. Friday night turned out to be a lot of fun. Yulia and her friends were already there when we started setting up around 8:15. We finished our sound checks, and then the guys and I walked over to their table to say hi. Yulia introduced us to everyone. One of the ladies joked that she was expecting a great performance from us since Yulia had been bragging about us all night. I glanced at my watch. Well, I guess we'd better get up there and see if we can live up to those expectations. I kissed Yulia before heading up to the stage, while the other guys went over to kiss their wives, who were sitting at another table. We already had people on the dance floor by the time we started our second song. I noticed a couple of women from Yulia's group dancing, and I glanced over at their table just in time to see someone apparently inviting my wife to dance. Yulia loves dancing, and I don't mind her dancing with other men while I'm on stage. It's rare for her to accept a slow dance, and even when she does, she always keeps a considerable distance between herself and her partner. Friends who sometimes come to our shows and sit with Yulia have told me that when she accepts an invitation from a stranger, she warns them that her husband is in the band and will be watching in case the dancer gets any ideas. I slightly regretted asking the guys to start early because everyone in Yulia's group was still there at 10 p.m. when we took our first break. One of the women even called her husband and asked him to join them. They didn't start leaving until well into our second set. Yulia and another woman stayed at the table when we took our second break. I grabbed a beer and joined them. Julie wasn't wrong when she bragged about you, Ed. You guys are really good, said Carol. Right? Yulia confirmed with a smile. Aaron, the keyboardist, is also a music teacher. For the other guys, it's just a hobby, but they all take it seriously and give it their best. Well, it shows, Carol replied. It's a shame I can't stay until the end of the show, but I have to go. It was really nice meeting you, she said as she got up to leave. Honey, I'm going to join the ladies' table, but I probably won't stay all night. The other musicians' wives were sitting at a table right in front of the stage. Yulia didn't get along very well with a couple of them, they liked to gossip about others, and not in a kind way. That explained her comment about the ladies' table. Still, she was always sociable and would sit with them if she didn't come with our friends. That's fine, honey. We're going back on stage. Give me a signal when you leave, and be careful on your way home. I will, darling. Now get up there and show them what a band with an incredible guitarist sounds like, she said, borrowing a line from her favorite song. It was past 2 a.m. by the time I got home. I was excited and hoped Yulia was still awake, but to my disappointment, she had fallen asleep on top of the blanket in her prettiest nightgown. It was clear she'd had the same thoughts I did, but the late hour had been too much for her. Starting a new school year is always a bittersweet experience. Sitting at my desk, I watched the various classes around me, some students I recognized, others I didn't. There were kids I adored and others I wasn't too fond of. I often thought about last year's graduates, most of whom I'd probably never see again, and wondered how they were doing now. Despite everything, I always tried my best to guide and nurture their talents. I did my best to impart my knowledge of music and, occasionally, a bit of life wisdom. I noticed Tommy raising his hand. It was his third year in my class. He was an average student, usually getting a C at best, and unlikely to become a musician. However, I always thought he had a real chance at becoming a stand-up comedian. He was the class clown, and I knew we were about to start the school year with a good laugh. Yes, Tommy. I had completely forgotten about Yulia's laptop until I saw Bob Kramer having lunch in the staff room. I went to the fridge, grabbed my lunch, poured myself a cup of coffee, and joined him. Hey, Bob. How was your summer? Hey, Dan. Not bad. And was able to take 3 weeks off this year, so we took the kids to a small lake in Michigan. We all had a great time. How about you? We exchanged stories about how we had spent the last 3 months before I brought up my real question. Look, Bob, my wife has this old laptop that doesn't work anymore. I was thinking about tossing it, but there are a lot of photos on it that she wants to recover. Would you mind taking a look at it? Sure, no problem. Do you have it with you? Yeah, it's in my car's trunk. Alright, let's finish lunch, and I'll go out with you to take a look. I'll take it home and check it out for you tonight. The next day, we didn't run into each other until after school. I was getting ready to head home when he called out to me from the hallway as I was leaving the classroom. Dan, got a moment? I turned and saw him approaching. I've got the photos you wanted, he said as he walked up to me. Follow me to my car, and I'll hand them over. Everything was in his trunk. He handed me a USB drive first. Here are all the photos I could find. They were scattered everywhere, some in folders, some in her email, and even more in Windows Shared Pictures folder. I think I got them all, around 300 in total. Then he pulled out the hard drive, which was neatly stored in a protective case. Here's the hard drive, he said, handing it to me. If you need anything else, just let me know. Thanks. That's great. So, what about the laptop itself? Do you want to keep it for parts? If you don't mind, I'd love to take it apart for spare parts. Sure, go ahead. Yulia only wanted the photos. I don't think she has any sentimental attachment to the case, I joked. Alright, thanks. I saw a few of the photos while I was transferring them to the USB. Some of them are pretty funny, he said with a grin. I thanked him again before we parted ways. Now that I had the photos, I started thinking about finding a special USB drive for Yulia. I had seen some that were really fancy, with rhinestone hearts all over them. Some could even be personalized with initials. I still had a month until Yulia's birthday, so I figured I'd check out Amazon and a few other sites to see what I could find, or at least, that was the plan. That evening, Yulia picked a couple of romantic comedies on Netflix, and we snuggled up on the couch until it was time for bed. There was no way I was going to miss another night of love, so shopping for the fancy USB drive would have to wait until the next day. The next day, I saw Bob again and wondered if he might know where I could get an elegant USB drive. I stopped him in the hallway. I knew he had to get to class, but it would only be a quick question. Hey, Bob. Hey, Dan. Need something else? I was just wondering if you knew where I could buy a fancy USB drive, something more suitable for a birthday gift. He laughed. You've come to the right person, my friend, but I've got to get to class. Catch me after school, he said, turning and walking down the hallway. I was still packing up my things at the end of the day when he walked into my classroom on his way out. So, you want to transfer those photos onto a nicer USB drive? Yeah, something a bit more special. Like I said, you've come to the right person. I have a friend who's a photographer. He runs a studio on the North Shore. It's pricey, but people in that area don't mind paying. He does a lot of high-end boudoir photo shoots. Just thinking about it made Bob chuckle as his mind wandered. Not a bad gig, huh? He gets paid a lot to take pictures of beautiful women. Of course, as he says, not all of them are beautiful, but there are plenty of trophy wives in that area. Many of them were, well, something else in a past life. He continued, anyway, he's the guy to go to for elegant USB drives. They're included in his photography packages, and he can even do custom engraving for you. The studio's name is Essence Foggy, and it's in Wimmett. You can find his number online. His name is Carl. Give him a call, tell him you're my friend, and that I sent you. I'm sure you'll like what he has, and he might even give you a wholesale price. Bob, once again, I owe you one. No problem, Dan. Always happy to help. I quickly wrote down the studio's name on a piece of paper before I forgot and slipped it into my briefcase. I called Carl the next day during lunch, and we arranged to meet at his studio on Saturday. Now, I just needed to come up with a plausible excuse for Yulia about where I was going. The studio was almost an hour's drive away, and I was hoping the whole trip wouldn't take more than 2.5 hours. I didn't like lying to her, but I knew she had forgotten about the photos again, and I really wanted it to be a complete surprise. Eventually, I told her I was heading to the golf course to practice with a friend. Bob's description of the studio turned out to be accurate. It was impressive, both inside and out. Carl greeted me at the door and invited me in. The first thing I noticed were the large photographs hanging on the walls of the outer office. Most of them were beautiful portraits. I recognized a few as local politicians and celebrities, but there were also some stunning women in expensive outfits. Bob was right, I said, admiring one of the photographs. You have a job most men can only dream of. He laughed. Yeah, I suppose. Is that someone's wife? I asked, still looking at the portrait. No, I would never publish a boudoir photo of a client, not even with their permission. She's a professional model. She certainly looks like one, I commented. All right, you mentioned on the phone that you're looking for a special USB drive for your wife. Come with me, and I'll show you what I've got. He led me to another room he called the showroom. This is where we bring clients to show them the photos we've taken and offer them related products included in our different packages, he explained. The room was filled with leather-bound albums that could be custom printed with photos, along with a variety of other high-end items, depending on how much the client was willing to spend. I started to feel a bit nervous, everything looked expensive. Carl pulled out several USB drives, which were arranged on a black velvet cloth. One immediately caught my attention. This one's incredible. You have good taste, Dan. That's my personal favorite. What's the price? $2,000. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly. I paused for a second, trying to think of anything else he might have said that could have sounded like 2,000. Nothing came to mind. Did you say 2,000? That's what my clients pay for it. Yes, it's plated in 24-karat gold, and those are real diamonds. I felt like I had made the trip for nothing. Carl, I'm a high school music teacher. This is way out of my budget. Sorry, I hope I didn't waste your time. He laughed again. I told you, this one's my favorite. Oh, yeah, that's obvious just by looking at it, I said. So, how much are you willing to spend? He asked, interrupting me. I hesitated, feeling embarrassed to admit it. Carl, I had to put a $300 necklace on a payment plan 2 months ago, and I'm still paying it off. I didn't even know USB drives like that existed. I was about to leave when he asked, can you pay $17? From 2000 to 17 was quite a leap. I assumed it would be something you could get at Walmart, but I was pleasantly surprised when he showed it to me. This is what I give to clients who order regular portraits. I buy them in bulk, 100 at a time. They're nickel-plated, and I have them in either a glossy or matte finish, like this one. It was definitely nicer than anything I could get at Walmart. There's a small shop a few blocks from here where they can engrave your wife's name on it. The owner does great work. Tell him I sent you, and he'll probably charge you about $10. Here, take this gift box too, it's a nice one, he said, handing me a beautifully crafted little box. I thanked him profusely and hurried over to get the engraving done. By the time I got home, it had been almost 3.5 hours. I figured Yulia might be a little annoyed since I'd been gone so long on a Saturday. She was starting to prepare dinner when I walked in. So, did you hit the ball so well you didn't want to stop, or did you hit it so badly you didn't want to leave until you fixed your swing? She teased. I laughed. Let's not talk about it, I said, letting her know it was the latter. I didn't want to lie more than necessary. Later that night, I grabbed a cup of coffee and went to our home office, telling Yulia I had some reviewing to do. She rarely bothered me when I was in there, so I was confident I'd have enough time to transfer the photos from Bob's USB drive to the one I just bought. I created a folder, inserted Bob's USB drive into the port, and started downloading. My laptop wasn't exactly high-end, so it took a couple of minutes. Wow, I thought to myself. 532 files. I removed Bob's USB drive and inserted the new one. It looked beautiful, and Carl was right, the guy at the shop had done an excellent job engraving Yulia's name. I started the transfer and waited. Once it was done, I didn't want to leave anything to chance, so I opened the USB drive to check that the photos had transferred properly. I opened the folder and briefly scrolled through the small thumbnails. There was one of us kissing. An idea struck me, I'd print the best one and frame it to give to her the day after her birthday. I slowly scrolled up the page, looking for photos of us together. I found one where it was clearly Yulia, but the person sitting next to her didn't seem to be me. I clicked on it, and sure enough, it was Yulia sitting very close to a guy I didn't recognize. Other people were milling about in the background, and it appeared to have been taken at a party. There was nothing incriminating about the photo, so I didn't think much of it and continued searching. I found one of us kissing, but it was blurry, and I figured there had to be better pictures of us. So, I kept scrolling. Then, I found another photo, but our faces weren't visible, only the back of my head and Yulia's arm around my back. I knew it was us because she was wearing the bracelet I'd given her the night we became a couple. I looked more closely at the small thumbnails, continuing my search for something suitable. There were plenty of great photos of her with her sorority sisters. I smiled, knowing this would be a real treasure for her. I kept browsing, occasionally clicking on a thumbnail only to find it wasn't worth printing. Then I noticed one photo that caught my eye, but I wasn't sure what it was. I was certain of what I was looking at, it had been taken from a distance, and it looked like it could have been Yulia and me. But I had to click on the photo to be sure. It was Yulia, but it wasn't me with her. It was another man, holding my wife while she leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. He had a drink in his left hand, and a bracelet was clearly visible on his wrist. I started wondering, who is this man? And why wasn't I there? This was obviously taken at a party. I looked more closely at the man, noticing something else that made me dig deeper. I felt my blood pressure spike as I found what I had been looking for, another photo. It looked like Yulia and me kissing passionately, but it wasn't us at all. I paused for a second. I've never owned a blue and white striped shirt. The 3 photos were of Yulia and this man, and they had all been taken after we had supposedly become an exclusive couple. I stared at the screen as a million questions raced through my mind at once. Who is he? Where was I? Were they just playing, pretending to kiss? Did their lips actually touch? Whose party was this? I searched for familiar faces in the background but didn't recognize anyone. The photos weren't very clear, but they were enough to make me wonder. Where was I when this happened? I used the Windows settings to enlarge the thumbnails to large icons and started searching more carefully. I found more photos of them together. Judging by the clothes they were wearing, it seemed like the photos were taken on 4 different occasions. I didn't appear in any of these photos, and I couldn't find any dates on them either. To stop my imagination from running wild with irrational thoughts, I decided to print the photo of her kissing the man on the cheek and confront her directly about it. But then I thought twice. Her birthday was so close, and as accusatory as those photos might seem at first glance, they could very well be completely innocent. Since the day we exchanged vows, she had been a devoted wife and had never given me a reason to doubt her loyalty. I decided she deserved the benefit of the doubt, at least until after her birthday. I was about to close the laptop when another idea crossed my mind. Since the photos had been taken at different times and with different cameras, there was no logical order in the way they appeared, they were literally scattered everywhere. Even the photos of Yulia with this man weren't grouped together. I thought, what if I reorganized the photos of her with this man and placed them at the top of the page, maybe separated by 1 or 2 photos of her alone? That way, I could observe her reaction the moment she started going through them. Would she show guilt, or would she scroll through them indifferently, which might indicate that there was nothing between them? I've never been the type to sit and stew over things, no matter how big or small the problem. I've always believed it's better to confront things directly. Sitting around worrying only made the situation worse. I knew how many questions would torment me over the next few weeks, but I had to try my best not to let them affect my behavior at home or around Yulia. So, I adjusted my plans slightly. Her birthday was on Friday, and I planned to give her the pendant along with a card that night. On Saturday, I would take her out for dinner and dancing at Plato's Play, and on Sunday, our parents were coming over for cake in the afternoon. Later, we would all go out for an early dinner together, after which my parents would head home from the restaurant. I planned to give her the USB drive on Saturday night so she could show the photos to our parents the following day. I briefly considered making Yulia uncomfortable by asking her who the man in the photo was when everyone was gathered around the computer. But again, without proof that anything inappropriate was happening, I decided not to humiliate her that way. Instead, I chose to wait until we got home on Sunday night before giving her the USB drive. During the next 2 weeks, Yulia only asked me once if everything was alright, so I guess I did a good job hiding my suspicions. She was overjoyed on her birthday and cried when I gave her the pendant. I didn't have time to dwell on my thoughts. Yulia was all over me in bed, and within 3 hours, I was on cloud 9 too. On Saturday, after dinner, we danced until 1 a.m. and then had another night of making love. I was glad I hadn't embarrassed her in front of everyone. On Sunday, when we were all together, it had been a while since we last gathered like that, and we ended up having a great time. I could tell our parents didn't want the evening to end, but Yulia's parents had a 2-hour drive home, so we said our goodbyes in the restaurant parking lot and went our separate ways. It was around 8:30 when Yulia and I arrived home. Yulia headed to the kitchen. "I'm going to make some coffee, honey. Want me to make enough for 2? I had only had 1 cup to counter the 2 glasses of wine I'd had at dinner, so it sounded like a good idea. "Yes, please." "Thanks, dear," I replied. I had the final gift in my jacket pocket. Honestly, I wasn't sure whether I should confront her. I wondered if I should just give her the USB drive and say nothing about the man. But that would go against my nature. The last 2 weeks had been unbearable. I knew there was no way I could keep living like this. I needed answers. She was facing away from me, making the coffee, when I sat down and placed a small, brightly wrapped box on the table. "I've got another gift for you, darling," I said. "I think I already know what it is," she responded without turning around. "But honestly, honey, I don't know if I have the energy for it tonight." "No, love," I said with a laugh. "That's not what I'm talking about." She pressed the brew button on the coffee machine and came over to sit with me at the table. Only then did she notice the small, brightly wrapped box. "Oh, honey," she said, reaching for the box. The lid revealed a beautiful USB drive with her name on it, but she still didn't quite understand what it was. She pulled it out. "Honey, this is great." "Thank you," she said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. "Wait," I said, getting up to grab my laptop. I placed it in front of her, the screen already on. "Go ahead, plug it in," I said. "That's usually what I tell you," she joked as she inserted the USB drive. The screen lit up, displaying all the photos. "They're photos from my old laptop," she exclaimed, jumping up in excitement and throwing her arms around my neck. She showered me with kisses and thanked me again before sitting back down, eager to relive her college days through the images. I sat across from her, watching her face carefully. When I had reorganized the photos earlier, I had placed one of her and the man sitting together near the end of the first row. 3 more of them were scattered across the second row, and the 2 where they were kissing were in the third row. I watched her closely, knowing there would be trouble. Yulia let out a small, sharp breath, a barely audible gasp, when she reached the end of the first row. Her eyes locked onto more thumbnails, zeroing in on the last photos of her and the man kissing. Tears began to well up in her eyes, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Want to tell me about this?" I said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "Who is he, and why are you kissing him while wearing the bracelet I gave you?" As far as I remember, that bracelet was supposed to symbolize our exclusivity. I could see she was trying to hold back tears. "Dane, Oh God, how do I explain this? I knew it would hurt you. You're telling me you slept with him when we were supposed to be exclusive?" I could already hear the anger in my voice, and I was sure she could too. No, I didn't sleep with him. I had to be sure, honey. I was so scared, I needed to be sure. I didn't want to make the same mistake my mother made. I knew her mother was going through a divorce because Yulia always called her mom, but she referred to her stepfather by his first name, Don. I had assumed Don was her stepfather, but I never asked what had happened, and it never came up in conversation. Maybe now was a good time to find out. "Can you explain that?" I asked, struggling to keep my tone polite. "My real father left us when I was 7, she began sadly. Mom admitted that most of it was her fault. She said she was in love with another man, but my dad proposed, and she accepted, thinking she could learn to love him. She said she never could, and deep down, she always hoped the other man would come back for her. Of course, that never happened. Eventually, my father left her for his secretary, well, that's what she says anyway. He left us with nothing. We struggled for years." She continued, "She met Don when I was 12. He was kind from the start, but Mom didn't want to rush into anything. She was afraid of making the same mistake twice. It took her 2 years to realize she really loved Don. But by then, they found out my father had never filed for divorce. Don gave her the money to file the paperwork, and they had to wait another 6 months before everything was finalized." I sat quietly for a few minutes, thinking about what she had said. A lot of it made sense, I suppose. But then, she had said her mother was in love with another man. "So, were you in love with the guy in the photo?" I asked. "I wasn't sure," she admitted. "I'd known him since I was a kid, and I was crazy about him since 6th grade. I was sure I loved him back then. We dated in high school, and my heart would race every time I was with him." "So, what happened?" "Obviously, you two broke up at some point. He moved away. His father got another job in St. Louis, and he and his mom stayed until he graduated. Then, he joined them. I was devastated. It took me weeks to stop grieving over him. He never called, and I had no way to contact him. So, I forced myself to move on." She paused before continuing. "Years later, I met you during my junior year at Northern, and I fell for you immediately. Then, one night, an old high school friend called me and said she'd run into Chuck. She told me he and his family had moved back to Chicago, and that he was studying at Aurora University, just a half-hour drive from Northern. And, well, you and I were already together by then. I laughed bitterly. It hurt when he left, but you knew you loved me. Yet you needed to be sure. You're telling me that you had doubts about marrying me, and you had to see him again to confirm your feelings? Dane, I had to be sure, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want us to get married with the ghost of Chuck hanging over us, causing doubts. I needed to know that I could love you the way you deserve to be loved. I didn't give her time to make up a story, so I believed what she was saying, but I couldn't approve of her actions. So, what's the full story? You saw him at least 4 or 5 times. Did you sleep with him each time? No. She said, shaking her head. We had a thing in high school a few times, but after that, I didn't sleep with him. Her response seemed illogical. Come on, I said. You just told me you needed to be sure I was the one, that you didn't love him more than you love me. Are you seriously telling me you didn't factor that into your little evaluation? You didn't feel curious to find out how much he'd learned since high school? By then, I could feel myself starting to lose my composure, and the tears that had been welling up in Yulia's eyes were now streaming down her face, accompanied by sobs. Honestly, Dane, she said through her tears. We didn't spend the night together. We got close, but I couldn't go through with it. How close? I asked angrily. That was the last time I saw him, she said, wiping her face. He had a friend, I don't remember his name, but he and his girlfriend lived in a 2-bedroom apartment off campus. We went there to hang out. We drank a little, and I think it was pretty clear that we were going to spend the night, though no one ever outright said it. Chuck and I had already been to a few parties together, and we'd kissed in his car a couple of times. Given our history, I think he assumed it was inevitable. She took a shaky breath before continuing. He laid me down, but as soon as he started touching me, I told him I couldn't go through with it, and I left. She broke down crying again. At that moment, I didn't know what to believe. I didn't want to believe her, but one thought kept haunting me. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes. It happened while you were teaching, she said. I know because I didn't want to answer your question. We were already engaged by then. I exclaimed. You went out with another man for 12 weeks after we got engaged. I was struggling to control my emotions. Where was your engagement ring? You're not wearing it in any of these photos. I kept it in my purse when I was with him, she admitted in a trembling voice. For the entire time I was teaching. I was only gone for a few weeks. You were gone for a couple of weeks when I got that call from Tammy, she said. Then I wrestled with myself for a couple more weeks, trying to decide whether or not to contact him. It was a struggle I clearly lost, she added quietly. I cut in angrily. She continued crying while nodding in agreement. So, how long did you see him, if it wasn't the full 12 weeks? On and off for 6 or 7 weeks, she admitted. Tammy gave me his number, and I called him. We talked for an hour, catching up. Then he told me they were hosting a party on campus that Saturday, and he invited me. We had a good time, but I felt so guilty that I told him I had to study for an important exam and left early. He called me a few days later and invited me to another party the following weekend. That's where this photo and the other one came from, right? The one where you're in a passionate embrace, and he's trying to shove his tongue down your throat. I said sarcastically. She looked at me as though she didn't understand what I was talking about. I knew exactly where the photo was on the page, so I turned the laptop toward me, quickly found it, clicked on it, and turned the screen back toward her. Yulia covered her mouth and shuddered. Dane, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. If it happened on just the second date, I'm sure it happened more than once, I said bitterly. I won't lie to you, Dane. Yes, it happened a few times, she admitted. Yeah, a few times, and much more than that, I added. She nodded again in agreement. I wasn't sure if I believed her when she said she hadn't slept with him, so I pressed her, wondering if she would reveal more. We kissed, she admitted. We kissed, and sometimes I let him put his hands where he shouldn't have. So, you let him touch you, but you're telling me he didn't sleep with you? Honestly, Dane, I'm telling you the truth, she said through tears. By that point, my stomach was in knots. I had a pounding headache, and every nerve in my body felt like it was being burned by a blowtorch. I needed to get out of there. She was still crying when I stood up and left, heading for my car. Driving through the countryside usually calmed me down, so I took the fastest route northwest toward rural roads and open spaces. Unfortunately, it didn't help. My mind was a kaleidoscope of images of Yulia and that guy Chuck, constantly generating new scenarios that only made me more suspicious. Maybe I was her second choice, and she only came back to me after he dumped her. She said he hadn't called her after he moved, so maybe she realized he wasn't interested in her. Maybe she figured out he was never going to chase her, and I was just her fallback option. And that story about her getting out of bed and leaving him with unresolved tension, how am I supposed to believe that? I stopped at a red light, and that's when I realized, I had no idea where I was. I wasn't even sure I was still in Illinois. Maybe I was in Wisconsin or Iowa. I glanced at my watch to check the time. It was almost 3 a.m. I need to be in class in 5 hours. To hell with it, I muttered to myself. I sat at the light until it changed twice, then picked up my phone and left a message for the school secretary. Now what? I wondered. I noticed several missed calls and messages from Yulia, all asking if everything was okay. The last one had come just 20 minutes ago, so she clearly wasn't sleeping well either. All the stress finally hit me. I was too tired to drive back home. I headed in that direction but stopped at the first motel I saw. I noticed the address when I checked in, New Diggings, Wisconsin, wherever that was. I didn't care. I was so exhausted that I don't even remember lying down on the bed, but I must have because that's where I woke up. I urgently needed the bathroom, so I stumbled out of bed. Sitting back down afterward, I checked the time. It was 11 a.m., and I had only 20 minutes before checkout. I quickly got dressed and tried to gather my thoughts while drinking the terrible motel coffee. Thoughts about insecurity and doubt continued to swirl in my mind. How can I be sure that I was really Yulia's first choice and not just the backup plan? I walked into the lobby, dropped off the room key at the front desk, and left. My plan was to find a restaurant where I could eat and think while enjoying a decent cup of coffee. But before I could even start the car, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was my mother-in-law. I opened the car door, sat down with one leg inside and the other outside, and answered. "Hi, Mom." I could hear the worry in her voice as she spoke. "Oh, thank God you're okay. Yulia's been trying to reach you all night, she hasn't slept a minute." "Yeah, we had a little fight last night. After she left, I got in the car and just drove around the neighborhood most of the night." I heard her sigh in relief. "I know. She told me everything. It's all my fault. You know, I'm the one who instilled all those ideas in her. She was only 12 or 13 when I started lecturing her about being absolutely sure before marrying someone. Mom, I understand wanting to be sure before getting married, but sneaking around behind my back and literally going out with another man for weeks after we got engaged, that goes beyond just wanting to be sure. That's deceit, pure betrayal," I said, feeling myself getting irritated again. I tried to calm down. How can I trust her after this? How do I know she didn't pursue a relationship with this guy behind my back? "Oh, Dan, you'll know if you stop and listen to your heart. I know you're angry, but please don't doubt Yulia's love for you." "That's the problem, Mom, I do doubt it. How do I know this Chuck guy didn't leave Yulia, and I was just her plan B? Dan, has she ever given you the slightest hint that you were her second choice? Trust me, Dan, I'm speaking from experience. If a woman feels like she's settling for second place, she can't help but show it, one way or another. When I married Yulia's father, I thought I'd learn to love him over time. But after a while, I started noticing all his flaws, little insignificant things that turned into big problems. I began to resent the man I had married and kept telling myself I could do better. I disrespected him, belittled him for years. He endured my abuse until he finally couldn't take it anymore, and I kicked him out of the house. Yeah, Yulia told me he ran off with his secretary and left you with nothing, I said. I heard her sigh again. That's not what happened, Dan. I wish it were that simple because the truth is much worse. He left because he couldn't take it anymore. By then, I had already destroyed his spirit and his self-confidence. He turned to drinking, and it consumed him. He lost his job and most of his friends. He ended up moving back in with his mother, and that's where he died from liver failure. He was only 42 years old. She paused, and I could hear her sobbing quietly before continuing. I feel like I killed him, she said through tears. I cried myself to sleep every night for a couple of weeks after I found out he had died. I felt so guilty. Around that same time, Yulia started talking about Chuck. Everything was Chuck this and Chuck that. I liked him well enough, but I knew they had been close for years, all the way through high school. I was pretty sure they were already in a relationship by then, so I became more involved. But she kept telling me she loved him. I never told Yulia this, but I felt relieved when he moved away. I thought it would give her the chance to meet someone new, someone who would see her for who she really was before falling in love with her. Then she met you, she continued, and I knew she had chosen the right man. I had heard parts of Yulia's mother's story before, but this was a revelation. So, you lied to Yulia about her dad running off with his secretary? Yes, she admitted. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I already felt guilty about how I had treated him. Yulia is all I have left. I didn't want her to hate me. So, yes, I blamed her father for everything. I just couldn't risk losing her too. I know what you must think of me after all this, Dan. But please, don't judge me too harshly. I tried to make up for my mistakes. I was a good wife to Don, and I tried to be a good mother to Yulia. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have preached so much to her about my insecurities regarding the man she would marry. I should have trusted her judgment more. And yes, lying to her about her father was wrong. Someday, I'll have to admit the truth, but I don't think now is the right time. She has enough to deal with at the moment. I agreed and assured her I wouldn't say anything. On my way home, I thought about everything Yulia's mother had said. One thing, in particular, stuck with me. Her mother had asked if Yulia had ever given me any indication that I was her second choice. The answer was a resounding no. In fact, until I found those photos, I considered myself one of the luckiest men in the world. I had a wife who genuinely believed there was nothing I couldn't do if I put my mind to it. But she never pressured me to be more than who I was. I love teaching, and she knew that. Most of our friends are married, and sometimes I cringe at how some wives speak to their husbands. The level of disrespect is obvious, and the husbands usually just stand there and take it. Yulia had never disrespected me or put me in such an uncomfortable position, whether in public or private. When I entered the house, Yulia was lying on the couch with her phone in hand. She opened her eyes and quickly sat up as soon as she heard the door. "Oh God, could you at least let me know you're okay? I was so worried, I didn't sleep all night. When you didn't come home, I called the school this morning to make sure you were all right. When they told me you were out sick, I got furious. I called my mom and asked her to check on you." "Yes, I spoke with her earlier," I replied. "I know she called. She called me back and told me you were okay. Have you eaten? Would you like some breakfast?" I almost had to smile. There she was, once again setting aside her own feelings to put my needs first. I'm fine. On my way back, I stopped at a little restaurant. The coffee was fresh, only about an hour old, I said. That sounds nice. The coffee I had this morning tasted like it had been sitting on the burner all night, she said. I didn't respond as I walked through the living room and into the kitchen. My mind was still racing, and I hadn't yet decided what I was going to do. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table to think. A few minutes later, Yulia entered and stood in the doorway. I'm not sure if I told you last night or not, but I want to say it again, I'm so sorry. It seemed so important at the time. I thought I had to be 110% sure that you were the one. Looking back, I should have known you were far better than Chuck in every way. I just had to see it for myself without feeling like I owed him a chance. Well, your mom takes responsibility for how she taught you to be certain, I replied. That's no excuse for what I did, Dan. I had to see it for myself. I'm so sorry. I know how much I hurt you, I can see it in your eyes. I'm so sorry. With those words, she turned and walked out of the room. I heard her steps on the stairs as she went up. I stayed in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts. I've always considered myself a logical thinker. As a teacher, I could take even complex problems, break them down, and explain them clearly so that everyone could understand. Somehow, I needed to switch off my emotions and turn on my brain. An idea came to mind. The laptop was still on the kitchen table from the night before. I opened it and started searching, but the results were disappointing. I'll have to do this the hard way, I told myself. Aurora University was only about 45 minutes away. I shouted that I'd be back in a couple of hours and left. The first thing I needed to do was find out more about this Chuck guy. I didn't want to ask Yulia for his last name because I didn't want to alert her, in case they were still in contact. Although I couldn't find his yearbook online, the university library probably had a copy. It took me a while, but I found it. His name was Charles Godman, and he majored in business administration. Great, I had his last name and his field of interest. I thought about searching for him on Facebook, but then I came up with a better idea, LinkedIn. It was more business-oriented, and most people posted their profile pictures there. I thought I'd need a university login to use the library computers, but it turned out someone had already logged in and left their session open. A few minutes later, I had what I was looking for. Chuck worked for a software company that sold specialized programs to auto repair shops. I wrote down the company's name and phone number before logging out. With more details to work with, I went back to Facebook. Now that I had specific information, I could use it to filter out the hundreds of other Charles Godmans I knew I'd find. I typed Aurora in the search bar alongside his name. Unfortunately, I only got 2 results, one was too old, and the other was too young. I broadened the search area, but I still came up empty. I kept at it for almost an hour, but I wasn't getting anywhere. Well, I thought, at least I know where he works. Just as I was about to stop searching, an idea struck me. The first man I had found on Facebook was the right age to be Chuck's father. I sat back down and looked at his profile again. It said he was married, but there wasn't much else. I checked his friends list and found Lisa Godman, who looked about my age. I clicked on her profile, and, voila, there he was. She was Chuck's wife. There were several photos of her and Chuck together. After digging a little deeper, I discovered they had a 3-year-old daughter. Outwardly, Chuck seemed like an average, hard-working family man who was happily married. Unfortunately, I knew all too well that appearances could be deceiving. Somehow, I needed to verify Yulia's story and make sure they weren't still seeing each other behind my back. When I got home, it was 7:30 p.m. I didn't see Yulia, so I checked upstairs. Judging by the damp spot on her pillow, it looked like she had cried herself to sleep. I went into the kitchen to see if she had prepared anything to eat, and when I noticed the empty dishwasher, I decided to order pizza for both of us. For the next few days, not much was said apart from Yulia's repeated apologies. Life went on, but I felt like I was walking through it in a daze. A week later, my thoughts and emotions were still all over the place. I loved my wife, and if I knew for certain that everything had happened exactly as she said, I could probably forgive her. But I couldn't shake my lingering suspicions. I still had 3 important questions that needed answers before I could come to any conclusions, 3 questions that tormented me day and night. How could I be sure she hadn't slept with him? How could I be sure I hadn't become her second choice after he left her? And how could I be sure they weren't still seeing each other? Confronting her wouldn't help. If I didn't fully trust Yulia, I certainly wouldn't trust him. Eventually, I came up with a plan, but first, I needed to do some groundwork that I called my mechanic, Hank. He had a great understanding of machines and always gave me fair service. My old Chevrolet visited his shop several times a year, and although Yulia's Hyundai was still under warranty, Hank and his wife, Melanie, had become friends over the years. I called him during my lunch break, and when he picked up, he said, "Hank's Auto. How can I help you?" "Hey, Hank, it's Dan Bryant." "Hey, Dan. What can I do for you?" "Hank, I need a favor." Oh, he said with a laugh. "I charge double for favors, or triple if it's illegal." "No, nothing illegal," I laughed in return. "Do you know Chuck Mann or a company called Service Solutions?" "I've heard of the company, but I don't know the guy." "Is he a friend of yours?" "No, not exactly. And I'm not trying to sell you any computer stuff either," I said. "Good, because I don't even have a computer in my office. Mel's brother does our bookkeeping, he's an accountant. Melanie would never ask me to buy anything like that. It won't cost you anything, and he probably won't even call. But if he does, I need you to say that I bought your shop." "What?" he practically shouted. "Who's going to call, and why the hell should I say you bought my shop? He works at Service Solutions, and I need an excuse to meet with him." "I'll tell him I bought your shop and want to discuss purchasing software," I explained. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "So, you don't actually want to buy anything? This is just a cover story to get a meeting with him. What are you planning to do? Nothing violent, right? You're not going to hit him or something, are you?" "No, Hank, I swear, nothing violent. I just need to ask him a few questions. He doesn't know who I am." More silence, then he sighed again. "This sounds way too much like some James Bond stuff, but alright. I'll tell Mel too, just in case she answers the phone. Are you sure you're not dragging me into something shady?" "I'm sure, Hank. Thanks. He probably won't even call, but I don't want to take any chances." "Alright, but just one thing, since you're the new owner, how about a promotion?" "Sure," I laughed. Remember me, the guy whose favorite phrase is, "as good as new." Part of my plan was now in motion, but I still needed to set up a meeting. I figured Chuck's company dealt with a few suppliers, so I wondered if I could invite him to lunch under the guise of discussing business. When I called Service Solutions and asked for his name, I was connected to his secretary right away. I was relieved that everything went so smoothly. I gave her a pseudonym and spun a story about how I lived out of town and was only in the area for a couple of days. When I asked if Chuck and I could have lunch, his secretary checked his schedule and gave me an appointment for the following Tuesday. On Monday morning, I informed the school that I would be taking a personal day the next day. So far, so good. I felt nervous as I walked into the restaurant, but I had rehearsed my lines well and knew them by heart. I recognized Chuck as soon as he entered, but I let the hostess lead me to his table. He stood up, and we shook hands, introducing ourselves. Our waiter brought coffee, said he'd be back in a few minutes, and left us to look at the menu. After studying it briefly, we both set it aside. As soon as he took a sip of his coffee, I told myself it was time to act and began playing my role. Sorry if I seem a little off. Something strange happened to me last night, I said with a laugh. This is Chicago, strange is normal, he joked. What happened? Well, I lived here as a teenager, and I've wanted to move back for a while. Buying Hank's shop gives me that chance. Anyway, last night, I was at the bar of a hotel, and I ran into a woman I went to high school with. Believe me, I don't usually share personal stories like this, but it was so weird. We started talking, found out she was divorced, and, well, I am too. One thing led to another, and she came back to my room. At that moment, the waiter returned, so we paused to place our orders before continuing. Chuck feigned interest, but I was sure he was only being polite. Go on, he said, encouraging me to finish the story. Well, I won't go into the details, but just when I thought we were going to have a great night, she suddenly jumped out of bed and said she couldn't go through with it. Talk about deflating your ego. I couldn't get dressed fast enough before she was out the door. I have no idea what I did wrong. I held my breath, waiting to see if he would take the bait. He laughed. Her name wasn't Julie Connors, was it? Got him. Connors was Yulia's maiden name. Now, I just needed to get as much information out of him as possible. Why? Don't tell me the same thing happened to you, I asked. He laughed again. Yeah, kind of. I knew Yulia from high school, but we lost touch for a few years after graduation. Then, during my final year of college, she called me out of the blue. We reconnected and started dating again. She was going to a different university, but it wasn't too far, so we saw each other on weekends. Sounds like a great reunion, I said, trying to keep things casual. How did it go? It was a bit weird from the start, he admitted. Weird how? I asked, leaning in slightly. Well, we didn't, get out of bed until our last year of high school, he said awkwardly. When she called, I figured we'd pick up where we left off. You'd think that would be easy, especially since she called you, I added. Exactly, he said. But we dated for a couple of months before things got, intimate. Then, when it finally happened, she did what your girlfriend did, she jumped up and said it was a mistake and left before I could even touch her. Suddenly, it felt like a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but I still wanted more information. So, you never got to spend the night with her after you reconnected? No, he said, shaking his head. Like I said, we messed around in high school, but not after we started seeing each other again in college. Oh, so nothing happened apart from a few kisses in the car? I asked. Oh, we kissed in the car a couple of times. I took her top off, and my hand wandered a few times, but that was it, he said casually. At that point, the waiter brought our meals, giving me a moment to gather my thoughts. I still had one more important question. Did you ever see her again? I asked. I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Then, a few days later, she finally called me back and apologized. Did she tell you why she jumped out of bed like that? I pressed. More or less, he said, pausing. I think she had another boyfriend and cheated on him with me, then had some kind of sudden moral crisis. And you never ran into her again? Never met her at some diner for a late-night hangout? I asked, doing my best to sound nonchalant. No, he said. She was special. I did try calling her again after she admitted she was seeing someone else. I even thought about starting a fight to see if I could win her back, but she'd already blocked my number. I guess she was serious about that guy. That was the last time I ever talked to her. Not long after, I met Lisa, my wife. We have a fantastic daughter, and I'm really happy now. So, I guess things worked out. He smiled. And you said you're divorced. Got any kids? I was using this small trick to keep him talking. I still hadn't decided what I would do once I got the information I was looking for. Do I keep lying and let him go on about selling software, or do I tell him the truth? If he had turned out to be a jerk, I probably would have just continued the charade, then walked away saying, "Call me, don't call me, I'll call you." But he seemed like a decent guy. "I have a confession to make," I said, putting my fork down. "But before I do, I want you to know this meal is on me, even the tip." Chuck looked confused, and I could tell he wasn't expecting what was coming next. "I'm not who I said I was," I said, interrupting him mid-sentence. "My name is Dan. Yulia is my wife." His mouth opened in surprise. I hadn't planned to tell him anything beyond my name, but I felt like I owed him an explanation. "So, you're not really interested in our software?" he asked, irritated. "I'm afraid not. I only just found out about your little reunion with Yulia in college. In fact, we were engaged at the time. She told me the whole story, but after keeping it a secret for all these years, I wasn't sure if I could trust her. I needed to make sure she was telling me the truth. That's why I came up with this little plan to see if I could get you to talk about it." "And did you find what you were looking for?" he asked, clearly annoyed. "Yes, I did. Your stories are almost identical. You can't imagine how relieved I am. How do you know Yulia and I didn't get together and compare stories?" he asked, still irritated. I knew he was trying to rattle me, but he'd already given himself away. "Because she has no idea I'm here or that I even know your last name," I said calmly. "Also, I can tell by your anger, it's genuine." "Yeah, well," he said, cutting a piece of his chicken parmesan, "I could use a sale, but I guess I can't blame you. If my wife had told me a story like that, I'd probably have done the same thing." "Did she ever tell you why?" he asked after a moment of silence. "I have to admit, I've thought about it a few times over the years, and I still wonder what it all meant. I mean, if she was so into you, why did she call me?" Chuck said, still sounding a bit puzzled. "If I tell you everything and pay for lunch, will you consider us even?" I asked with a smile. He looked me directly in the eyes, as if summoning all his courage, then I saw the slightest smile appear. "Yeah, sure," he said, nodding slightly. "Why not?" I told him the whole story about how Yulia's mother had persistently preached to her that she needed to be absolutely sure before getting into a serious relationship. I explained how Yulia hadn't even known Chuck was back in Chicago until we were already engaged. I apologized again for pretending to be someone else and explained how I needed to be certain that Yulia had chosen me, not him, and that I wasn't her second option after he left. Chuck assured me once more that everything had happened exactly as Yulia had told me. He even thanked me, saying that the incident had always puzzled him, and although he hadn't made a sale, he was glad that things had finally been cleared up. As we left the restaurant, I had the impression that we might have even become good friends under different circumstances. Instead, we shook hands in the parking lot and said goodbye. On my way home, I still had a lot to think about. I thought again about the relationship some of my friends had with their wives, the arguments and the lack of respect some women showed toward their husbands. I especially remembered one night when Yulia sat with the women's table during one of our performances. Linda, the drummer's wife, made a disparaging comment about the band, and Yulia went after her, scolding her back and forth until Linda ended up in tears and apologized to Yulia and the rest of the group. When it was all over, I couldn't think of anyone I'd rather have on my side than my wife. If the roles were reversed, I had no doubt that Yulia would fight for me and for our marriage with everything she had in her. She deserved nothing less from me. It was only 2 p.m. when I got home, and I still had about 3.5 hours before Yulia would arrive. I made a quick call, then heated a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table to think. For some reason, God knows why, I felt the urge to take another look at the photos of Yulia and Chuck. I opened the file on my laptop, but I couldn't find it. She had deleted all the photos of them together. I found that interesting and wondered if she had done the same with the photos on her flash drive. I had a pretty good idea where she would keep it, and sure enough, I found it in her jewelry box. I connected it to my laptop and checked. Sure enough, all the photos of Chuck were gone. All the other photos were still there, but not a single one of Chuck remained, not even one kept as a memory. I went back to my car and leaned back in the seat, feeling good. Any lingering doubts about Yulia's fidelity at that point would have been pure paranoia. I had no doubt, I was her man, and she was my woman. That thought brought the biggest smile I'd had in a long time. When Yulia walked in and saw me in a suit, she immediately looked concerned. With how stressful things had been lately, I couldn't blame her. "What's going on, Dan? Why are you wearing a suit?" she asked. "I have a date today," I said. "And if you don't go upstairs and shower quickly, we'll be late." She stood there for a second with a puzzled look on her face. "Come on, hurry up," I said, cutting her off. "I'm taking you out to dinner." "What's this all about?" she asked. "I'll tell you later. For now, hurry up, we have 30 minutes before we need to leave." I think she started to relax a little when she saw my smile. I caught a glimpse of her as she came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel. "Are you sure you don't want to stay home?" she teased. "We don't have a reservation, but keep that thought in mind for later," I replied with a grin. This day had cost me quite a bit. By the time I had lunch with Chuck, the bill was almost $50, including drinks and tip. Dinner at Odette downtown would cost more than double that. Yulia was cutting into her steak Diane when I finally answered her question about why we were celebrating. "I had lunch with Chuck today," I said casually. "With who?" she asked, putting a piece of steak in her mouth. "Chuck Godman." Yulia froze, and then she choked on her food. For a second, I thought I might have to perform the Heimlich maneuver, but she managed to get it down and took a quick sip of wine. Our waiter noticed and rushed over. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked anxiously. Yulia nodded while drinking more wine, then answered in a raspy voice, "Yes, I just swallowed it wrong." She coughed a few more times. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked. She nodded again. "Yes, I'm fine," she said more clearly and glanced at the waiter. "Honestly, I'm fine." "You had lunch with Chuck?" she repeated. "How did you know where to find him? What did he tell you?" "Well, you'll be glad to know he confirmed your story." She continued shaking her head as questions swirled in her mind. "I don't even think I ever told you his last name. How did you know how to find him?" "Doesn't matter. I found him, and before long, he started talking about you," I said. "Not right away, but I figured out how to bring you up in the conversation. All this time, the poor guy has been wondering what he did wrong that night." "Did he know who you were?" she asked. "Not until after he told me everything I needed to know, and then I told him the truth." She kept staring at me as if she didn't believe what I was saying. I decided to give her proof. "You didn't tell me he undressed you in the car a couple of times," I said calmly. I saw her eyes widen in shock, and I knew she was convinced. "I knew you didn't believe me," she said angrily. "Would you believe a story like that if I were the one telling it?" "Yes, I would," I replied firmly. "Listen, Yulia, you kept your little adventure after our engagement a secret from me all these years. I found out about it by accident. That wasn't fair. You left me in the dark and cheated on me with another man. I can understand your reasons, but that doesn't justify your actions. If you weren't honest back then, how can I know you're being honest now?" I saw Yulia's eyes start to fill with tears, but I needed to get my point across. "Is there anything else you haven't thought of?" She didn't say a word, so I continued. "How do I know you won't go back to Chuck and leave me? Maybe Chuck already had someone else, and he's the one who ended things. Maybe I was just your second choice, your backup plan. You can't think like that, she said, raising her voice loud enough for people at nearby tables to turn and look. She lowered her voice. Dan, have I ever given you that impression? No, you haven't. But you can't blame me for considering the possibility, I said. I saw tears rolling down her cheeks. Don't cry, darling. I'm not trying to punish you, I just want you to understand how serious this is. This time